This video will show you how to use Draw.io to create your entity relationship diagrams. First, open a browser and type in Draw.io. When you get this screen, click Create New Diagram. On this screen, click Create. And we're going to close the General tab here and open up the Entity Relationship area. Entity Relationship Diagrams consists of two main components, entities and relationships. Entities are represented by boxes and relationships are represented by lines. To get started, click on the box that's second from the right and drag it to the work area. So let's pretend we're creating a database for a library. And let's start with the entity for books. So in order to change the name, just double click on it. And now we've named this entity Books. Every book has a unique identifier called an ISBN. So we're going to use that unique identifier to identify our books. Then we're going to set up attributes associated with the books. In order to add additional attributes to our entity, we can go up to Edit and say Duplicate, or we can use the shorthand command of Control-D. Now I'm going to delete this little extra space here by just hitting the Delete key on my keyboard, just so everything's lined up kind of nicely. So the first attribute I'm going to identify by double-clicking on it is row 1, and I'm going to change that to title. Then I'm going to double-click on row 2, and I'm going to change that to author. I'm going to click on the next line and change that name to publisher. I'm going to click on the next one and change that to number of pages. So all of these rows in our entity describe a book. As you think about the attributes describing a book might have more than one author. In our entities and in our tables, we can only put one value in for each attribute, for each row in our entity. So I'm going to click Delete and delete the author. And I'm going to set up a new entity for authors by clicking on it and dragging it over. So in this case, I'm going to call this Authors. And there's no existing identifier for authors per se, so I'm going to make one up for my database, and I'm going to call it Author ID. Then I'm going to set up the author's first name. I'll double click on row 2 and set up last name. And maybe I want to have some additional information like where the author lives. So let me click on row 3 and we'll go up and duplicate that a few times so that we can add additional information into our authors table. And once again, I'm going to kind of click on this extra blank space to get that out of my diagram. So here I can put in street, city, state, zip code, and if I want to put in additional information like country, I can just duplicate the last attribute and make another attribute. Okay, so now we have to figure out the relationship between books and authors. A book can have one-to-many authors. Books don't write themselves yet. Maybe in the future computers will write books. But right now we're going to assume that every book has one or more authors. Now let's look at the reverse. An author could write many books, but maybe if this is a new author, they haven't written any books yet. So an author has 0 to many books. That's the relationship that we want to pick. And we have several different relationship lines that we can draw, that we can select from. And for this particular example, this is the one we want. So I'm going to click on that and drag it over. Now the way it works with the relationship lines is that you're going to write a relationship sentence, or in your head describe the relationship. A book has one-to-many authors. So the one-to-many authors is going to get dragged to our author entity. And you want to drag it to an area where you see I get a little blue circle, meaning that it's attached to that entity. And then if we read our relationship in the other direction, an author has 0 to many books, we want to connect the 0 to many line to the book entity. And you noticed that it tried to connect to an attribute line. You want to make sure that when you connect it, it connects to the actual entity itself. And if you do that, you're able to move around your entities, and you can see that the relationship line goes with it. If we click on the relationship line, because sometimes we might move our entities around and the relationship line might get a little bit misconfigured, you can go up to this area and modify the shape of your relationship line. In this case, it got modified in a way that we don't like it. So I'm going to use the Control-Z command and move it back to the way it was. So this could be the start of our library database, and we'd have to add additional information to it, like the members of the library, the librarians, etc. And those would be additional entities. An entity you can think of as a noun, a person, place, or thing. And each of those entities is going to have attributes describing that entity. And that's how we would get started with our entity relationship diagram. When we go into our logical data modeling, we're going to have to replace the lines associated with many-to-many relationships. This relationship line is called a many-to-many relationship line because the crow's foot at the end near authors indicates a one-to-many relationship, and the crow's foot line at the location of books indicates an author has 0-to-many books. And so the relationship, when we talk about one entity to another, refers to the maximum. Books can have many authors, authors can have many books. So when we create our logical model, we're going to need to replace these many-to-many relationships with a 0-to-many or 1-to-many relationship. And the way we do that is by creating an association entity, an entity that's going to replace the relationship and create a new association between books and authors. The template for an association entity is the one that's shown on the right of the entities here. So let's click on that and drag that over to our workspace. And in this case, I'm going to double click on the table and I'm going to change the name to Book Authors. This can be anything. But what I'm going to set up in this entity is I'm going to use the primary key from books and the primary key from authors to set up a new relationship between these two entities. So in this case, my first primary key will be ISBN, and the second primary key will be, click on that, author ID. Now I may have certain attributes associated with the combination of books and authors, or I may not. So if there are no attributes in your association entity, you can delete the attribute line. And then we're going to create some new relationships here. Over here on the left-hand menu, we see we have quite a few different types of relationships. But what we want to do is say a book can have one-to-many book-author combinations, but the combination of books and authors is going to be associated with one and only one book. Likewise, with the authors, a book-author combination is going to be associated with one and only one author. So we might not be able to find the exact relationship that we're looking for, so we can bring over another one and modify that. But first, let me show you all of the relationship combinations we might have. At the end of your relationship line, there are 4 possibilities on each side of the line. This symbol means the minimum is 0. That's what the circle is for. And the maximum is many. That's what the crow's foot indicates. This symbol means the minimum is 1, that's the vertical line, and the maximum is many. This one means the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1. And in this case, the minimum is 1 and the maximum is 1, and we would refer to that as 1 and only 1. On the other side of the relationship line, we can have the same 4 symbols. And so if we have 4 symbols on one side of the relationship and 4 symbols on the other side of the relationship, if you do the math, that means 16 combinations. And all of those combinations might not be available to you in Draw.io. So we can create our own relationship line. So I'm going to go back to Draw.io now. And the relationship line that I want is that a book has one-to-many book author combinations. And once again, see how it highlighted it on the attribute ISBN. We want to kind of drag it so it highlights it on the overall entity. And then this other end I can modify to show that we want 1 and only 1. So if we go over here and pull down this menu, if I click here, you see it changes that side of the line. That wasn't exactly what I wanted, so let's change that back. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. What I want to do is change the other side of the line. So let's pull down this drop down, and in this case I want to pick 1 and only 1. So I'm going to just scroll up a little bit here, click on that line, and then drag it up to so that it's highlighted on the entity. Alright, so I want to do the same thing again for the other relationship between book authors and authors. So I can click on that and duplicate it. And in this case, I'll drag the one line. Once again, you got to kind of make sure it highlights the entire entity, and drag the other line here. And you can see that looks a little funny, so we can kind of play around with that a little bit and get that corrected. And I see that it's not connected exactly to the entity, so let me drag that until we get the highlight. And then I'm going to hit delete to get rid of this other relationship line, because we don't want to have a circular relationship. So in this case, a book, looks like I need to pick one-to-many here, so let's fix that. And likewise, we'll fix it here. In this case, because an author may not have written a book yet, we're going to pick 0-to-many. So a book has one-to-many book-author combinations. A book-author combination has one and only one book. A book-author combination has one and only one author. An author may have zero to many combinations. And as I mentioned before, we would add additional entities for library members, librarians, etc. if we were going to be doing a full entity relationship diagram for a library. So when you're done with your entity relationship diagram, there's two things that you want to do. You want to export it as a PDF so that you can submit it for your assignment. So we'll say export PDF, and we'll give it a name. I'll call it library, and save it to your PC by clicking on device. I happen to be using the Chrome browser, and my browser is set up so that it saves that diagram in the downloads file. If you're using a different type of browser like Firefox or Safari or a version of Internet Explorer, for instance, you may get a dialog box asking you where you want your diagram to be saved. But since I'm using Chrome, it's set up to save it in the downloads folder. So I have my PDF, but what we also want to do is save the diagram itself so that you can work on it next week. We're going to be building upon our entity relationship diagrams from week to week. So we want to click the Save command. And once again, it has, because I'm using Chrome, has saved the diagram itself in the Downloads folder. In this particular case, it named the file Untitled. If you want to give your file a title, which I suggest, use the Save As, and in this case we can call it Week 2, for instance. Click on Device and it will save it, because I'm using Chrome, in my Downloads folder. So let's just look at how we can open up a diagram for the subsequent weeks. So I'm going to close this one, and I'm going to open up Chrome again and put in Draw.io. And in this case, I'm going to say Open Existing Diagram. And I'll go to my Downloads folder, open my Week 2, and we're right back to where we started.